Salim, there's an article in cityjournal.org by Guy Sorman. To quote from that article, he says, "It is high time to denounce the threat posed by Xi and the Communist Party of China. Like useful idiots, we've not only helped the party prosper, but even worse, we've given up on our humanitarian, democratic, and spiritual values in doing so." Is he correct?
Oh, he's more than correct. He's absolutely on the money, Robert. I mean, let us no longer have any misgivings or hesitation to say what the reality is. Naming things is very important, and it is this pandemic, this Wuhan virus, the coronavirus or COVID-19, is now not only a Chinese virus, this is an instrument of warfare unleashed by the Chinese gangsters. The Beijing communist regime is a gangster regime, and that's what is the fundamental feature of a communist regime. Stalin was a gangster regime. Mao was a gangster. The difference between Xi Jinping and Mao and Stalin is that Xi Jinping is now running the world's second largest economy. In other words, between the 1930s and now in the 21st century, the Chinese gangster regime has the most advanced technology, a whole lot of it stolen from the West. That is the intellectual property theft that has taken place over the past 30 years. So equipped with the most advanced technology, Robert, here is a parallel. Think about it. 9/11 was an assault on the freedom and on the West by attacking New York and Washington by the gangsters of the Islamist Al-Qaeda network. No doubt about it. It was gangsterism at play. These terrorists are gangsters. And we now have 20 years later, or almost 20 years later, the gangster regime in Beijing has unleashed a deliberate attack on America and the West.
How do you know that it's deliberate, Salim? What evidence do you have for that? Because the ruling theory is that the virus was picked up in a wet market, transmitted via another species in much the same way that other viruses like that, the avian flu, swine flus. So what evidence do you have that it was a deliberate planting of this virus in Wuhan?
Robert, it is a circumstantial evidence. We know that the man who brought this information and passed it on to the authorities, immediately to his superiors and to the regime in Beijing through the mechanism of the regime's own institutional arrangement. I'm talking about the young doctor in Wuhan, Dr. Li Lenwiang. He brought this to the notice. This was way back in December. And he was dealing with a spike in his patients that was coming in large numbers. And he identified that the patients were suffering with the sort of virus that they had seen in the SARS avian flu pandemic of 2003. He reported this to the authorities, and the authorities in turn held him as a prisoner, quarantined him, forced him to apologize, and he died. We don't know what circumstances under which he died. We can only infer, given the nature of the gangster regime, that probably he died as a result of some sort of torture or physical oppression.
I wouldn't be surprised, Salim, because he was a 37-year-old healthy young man. dying from the coronavirus is so rare for such a cohort. It's for such a healthy young man. I would assume, I would agree with you that you can assume that he was murdered.
Right, right. The circumstances is very, very questionable. So when I said deliberate, we're pulling together the dots that is the circumstantial evidence. So this was in December. He died in February. He had been removed from the scene. And the situation worsened. The situation worsened as a result of the population from Wuhan going into their travel mode, traveling out of the capital, Wuhan, in the Hubei province, during the lunar festival in China, the Chinese New Year, in January. As a result of the Chinese New Year, the Chinese economy, factories, and work came to a halt for that week. And people moved out, people started mingling, they began traveling. And then they returned, or rather, the system did not open, the factories were not open. That's when the announcement came that the factories are not opening up, and people in the West at the other end of the supply chain started getting worried about it. And the news about what was happening in China started filtering out. All the while, the Chinese authorities did not advise the Western governments, did not inform in detail the United States, did not, in fact, did the opposite, got the World Health Organization to sort of step up and say the Chinese were dealing with a problem and they were dealing it right, and the protocol that they were following was right, and there's nothing to worry about. Now, the Chinese, we now know that the Chinese had been engaged in investing abroad, had been putting up plants and factories and moving out or exporting workers. So this leads to, not only in Africa, but in other parts of the world, the most sensitive on this matter were the Italians up in the northern region, in the Lombardy region. There is, now we are getting the report, there were something in the nature of around 200,000 Chinese workers in the leather industry and in the fashion industry and in the garment industry and textile industry. Not only Chinese workers and Chinese business, but workers and businesses from South Asia and other parts of Southeast Asia. So these were the migrant workers. In the case of the Chinese workers and people working out of the Lombardy region in northern Italy, they went home for the Chinese New Year, and then they came back. So now you draw your conclusion. Which is the most affected region in the West, in Europe? It is the Italians. It is the northern region of Italy. This thing that began in Wuhan, whether it was an accidental leak of the virus from the level 4 lab, the biological virology lab in Wuhan, and that's the only lab that they have in China, we understand. And so whether it was an accident or, as we know and as we have talked about previously, that there was an ongoing trade going on between the people working in the lab and the wet market 20 kilometers outside of Wuhan, and that this illegal, in fact criminal trade of selling the animals in the laboratory for testing and for experimental purposes were being sold by the employees of this level 4 lab to the market for extra cash flow. And so these animals infected with all sorts of bacteria and viruses out of that Wuhan L4 lab went into the food chain and people ingested it. So there you have it. I mean, this is now no longer a matter of accident, and the Chinese government did not know, that the gangster regime of Xi Jinping did not know. This is the world's second largest economy. And the world's second largest economy that has come about as a result of the participation of the Western governments over the last 30 years.
So let's connect the dots that you've outlined so far. Whether it was deliberate or not, there is certainly a lot of negligence, criminal negligence on behalf of the communist government of China by spreading false information, disinformation, suppressing information, most likely murdering dissent on their plan. So the response from the West has fit right in with their ultimate goal, which is to be the world dominant economic power, by putting in such draconian restrictions, especially here in Canada. There's now even talk of ceasing interprovincial travel, which is completely unreasonable if you ask me. But that aside, even though that's all very important, I want to turn the discussion now, if you would, Salim, to what you said to me over the phone last night, which is that you're having second thoughts about the seriousness of the virus and the measures that we're taking, the governments are taking, specifically because in a normal flu season in Canada, 3,500 people die from the flu normally. So far today, I think there has been 19 deaths in Canada from the Wuhan virus. A considerable discrepancy, a considerable difference in the seriousness. Now, some might say that this is because of the measures that are in place, but I've been out and about in town, and there's still a lot of social interaction that's going on, and yet we only see 19 deaths after having the virus in this country for about a month now. So explain to the viewers why you might think that these changes that are being implemented in Canada fit right in with the Chinese government's plan for economic domination.
Well, let me respond to what you're saying, Robert, and what we talked about, as you just mentioned earlier on in our private conversation over the phone, is my concern, and I'm not alone on this matter, you know, in the sense that we're all picking up information, we're all trying to analyze the situation that we have of what is available. And what is available that is coming out of China is open to a lot of skepticism and doubt, you know, I mean, the numbers and so on and so forth. It could very well be that the latest number is somewhere in the figure 82, 83,000 in China, and the bulk of it is from Hubei province in the 60,000 plus numbers from Hubei province. And the number of deceased, that the figures that we have, is somewhere around about 3,500. But we could not say that either these numbers do not tell the true extent of what is happening in China, that it could be much bigger than the numbers, or we have to wait and see and extrapolate. But given the numbers that we have, we can see that the Chinese have basically flattened the curve. And for the last week, the numbers have not spiked. It is the number that they're coming out.
If their information is to be trusted.
Pardon?
If their information is to be trusted.
Well, that's what I said. I prefaced my remark that, you know, the numbers and the facts that are coming out of China, we have to take it with a great deal of skepticism. But that's the number we have, and with that number we are looking at it, you know, and that's the number that is also being provided to us by the Chinese or by the WHO, that they are collecting from the Chinese. And therefore, that's the number that the Americans and the Europeans they have to play with and to look at. The spike that has taken place, the number that has spiked is in the West. We saw the number make a huge jump in the United States. Now, America is somewhere around about, you possibly have the number, I don't have it right in front of me, but close to 15,000 or thereabouts, and there's about under 300 deaths that has been reported. And that
I
all
have, yeah, yes, the latest figures are 26,975, deceased 354.
Correct. So there you have it. It's under 400 and 26,000. So there's been a huge spike in that sense. But and of course we are seeing what is happening in Europe, right across Europe. But if you take the numbers by itself, this is no more than a common flu number. Could be even less than a common flu. And so we have to put these numbers and what is happening alongside the numbers that we do know in a definitive sense of a pandemic. So we can go back to the 2003 SARS, but the most recent one is the 2009 H1N1 swine flu, where it was somewhere in the region of 16 million Americans were infected, and the number of deceased were in the range of 12,000 plus, okay? So from the numbers that we have, it is a long ways to go to the numbers of what was H1N1 flu. And let's hope that we are not going to reach that number. So we're just doing this for the comparative purposes. So the question that I think a lot of us, for instance, yesterday, we are talking today, this is Sunday morning. Yesterday in the National Post, Conrad Black was writing in his weekly column, Wall Street Journal, and many other online journal and newspaper people are now writing and saying the thing that I was sharing with you. The concern is the cure, the remedy that is being implemented to flatten the curve of the coronavirus pandemic, is this worse than the disease itself? That's the question. We are very concerned, or should be concerned, that the measures that have been taken by, in a large part as a result of the fear and panic that has been created. And so it raises the question, who benefits? Of course, the Chinese benefit, because the Chinese are seeing and possibly laughing their guts off. I have this image in front of me of the Chinese Buddha, the big, fat, iconic figure, laughing and bawling his heads off, that we in the West are not only shooting at our feet down, but we are blowing our economy apart.
It's true.
I mean,
if you just think of the numbers of people unemployed or not going to work, I think you're talking about trillions of man hours of productivity lost in just a couple of weeks. Look at the stock market. Look at the restriction in trade. This is unprecedented. I think that there's even been comment by some people that not even in World War II did we see such a hit to the economy. In fact, there was a stimulus to get people working. This is a stimulus to keep people at home and not work. So this is a double whammy in that sense. It's unprecedented, and China, as you say, is the beneficiary of this. Now, whether it was intentional or not, it doesn't seem to matter. They're winning this war.
Once the start thing unfolding, then it's no longer a matter of the intention. It is the consequences we are dealing with, and the consequences in this case is the unintended consequences. President Trump had it right at the beginning. On January 31st, he implemented a travel ban on China. He has followed that up in the past 2 weeks with a travel ban on Europe. And now he has followed that up by closing the borders with Canada and Mexico. In other words, he has, in a sense, sealed the United States so that the American government and the American institutions and the American medical system can deal with the challenge of the Americans. And that's absolutely right and proper. He has done that. The question is whether we in Canada have taken sufficient measures. But after having said that, it is the lockdown and the shutdown of the economy that has now risen up. I mean, we can see the figure people are calculating and speculating. It has been in the Wall Street Journal of this weekend that if this continues for another month, we're talking about the American economy, the world's largest and greatest and strongest economy of the last 3-4 years, 20% of the economy will be blown away.
I drove to Toronto yesterday, Salim, as you know, and my trip there, I would say the traffic, which is normally gridlocked at that particular time and of day, was about 50% reduced, and that included truck traffic. There was a decided lack of trucks on the road as well, I would say reduced by 50%. This is so devastating. Mind you, it made for a wonderful trip to Toronto, but still, it's devastating as far as the economy goes.
Right. Well, I flew back on last week on Thursday evening from Montreal. Going to Montreal and coming back to Montreal, the traffic was, that is the passengers in the airport, both at Pearson and at Montreal, the passengers were not in the usual numbers one could see. The traffic was not there, air traffic. But coming back last Thursday, it was at least 50% down. Walking through Pearson Airport, walking through Montreal Airport, it was very, very clear that things were taking effect. And as you say, the situation that we have arrived in, this complete lockdown, instead of thinking it through strategically and isolating the suspect infected people, which would have been the proper way instead of doing what they have done, means that we have really, really inflicted a terrible economic blow on our own economy. By the way, when we're talking about the economy, people have to understand this. We're talking about people. We're talking about people. Economy means people. And by shutting down the economy, we have shut down the livelihood of the people. Now, those people, the people in the government, and it's the people in the government that are making the decision and talking about it, they have a paycheck coming. But if almost half the people, working people, in an economy such as ours are in the private sector, more than half. And then within the private sector are the small businessmen. I'm thinking about the people, in the retail business, in the travel business. These are people shut down, have no paycheck coming in. Their entire, livelihood will have been destroyed. People on pension, their livelihood is now destroyed overnight. They don't know what the value of their stocks and shares are going to be.
There's a comparison. Sorry, Salim. There was a comparison I read today with Japan's measures in this virus situation. And they have not shut down their economy the way that the West has, or at least Canada has. Instead, what they have over there is an 80% compliance of people wearing masks. And their numbers are nowhere near the numbers in Italy or in China. They're actually more like our numbers as far as confirmed cases and deaths, so very, very low. And they've done it without destroying their economy. It's a simple matter of wearing a mask, which, like I said, was about 80% compliance.
And that's the piece that you read, Guy Sorman's piece. He's pointing out not only about the Chinese culpability of the Chinese gangsters in this matter, which we have talked about, but it's pointing out also, as many others have been pointing out, that this could be simply a common flu virus, because this is a SARS virus in a new genetic morphing that has taken place. This is SARS-2. SARS was a coronavirus. This is coronavirus 19. It's a more evolved, genetically evolved virus that has caused the pandemic. But we dealt with SARS. There is no such measures that we took when dealing with SARS in 2003 that we have gone overboard in 2020. Now, I think, you and I'm speaking here, we don't have any information, or we don't have any internal connection. We are speculating, we're making speculation on the best information available. And so I believe the president responded on the basis of the advice provided to him by the experts that he pulled together and made the vice president, Pence, the head of the task force, to deal with the situation. And they're briefing every day, and they're talking about it, and they're running this through. And the point man on this matter from the expert side is Dr. Fauci of the National Institute of Infectious Disease, Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So he has followed their advice to do what they wanted to do, or wanted to see the action take place in terms of flattening the economy. But I also believe, given the way President Trump has normally dealt with boldly with issues right from the beginning of his administration, that he is going to turn things around, that this will not go too long, that this will be, as he said, when the lockdown began, for 3 weeks. So we can see that things will be lifted by middle of April or third week of April, unless this panic does really turn out to be a Spanish flu size pandemic. And that, by the way, is what the epidemiologists and people like Dr. Fauci, they are fighting the last war, so to speak. So for them, it is the Spanish flu model, which to our audience, if they are thinking about the Spanish flu as the model, what are we referring to? We are referring to that outbreak that began in the middle of World War I. And by the time it ended 2 years later, had taken a toll of, the lower estimates are in the range of 50 million, the upper estimates are in the range of 100 million that swept across the world. I don't believe that this is, and no one has called it out, that this is another Spanish flu. So I think this is an overreaction, and that President Trump is going to turn things around and let the economy get back on its footing. And he has been saying that once the economy is back on its footing, it will roar back. The pent-up demand will push the economy forward. So here is my observation, Robert. The American economy over the last almost 4 years, since the 2016 when President Trump came into office, has seen the most astounding turnaround in the case of American economy. The stock market had broken all historic records. The employment figures were down to 3% unemployment, that's basically a full economy. Wages were soaring. And what he said, he was going to change the supply chain and bring back jobs, bring back industry. This is why the Chinese have been have put President Trump and his administration in the crosshair, and the globalists have put the administration in the crosshair in complicity with the Chinese. So that's what will happen, I expect. But that raises the question about us. A healthy economy can take, just like a healthy body, can take some blows and come back. But what about an economy, like a body, a human body, that is already weakened by years of negligence and ideologically driven policies that have purposely weakened the economy, as in the case of Canada? Our economy was weak and weakened by the ideologically driven policies of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, climate change, and so on. UN Agenda 2030, migration, the UN Compact on Migration, Paris Accord, shutting down our natural resource economy, the whole Western economy has been basically frozen. And now with the crash of the oil industry worldwide, that is again the fight that is taking place between Saudi Arabia and Russia, that has led to the bottom falling out of the oil economy. Alberta has been devastated, and Alberta was our crown jewel, supplying the equalization payment to Quebec, to Ontario, to the maritime provinces. So the question that hangs, and the answer is evident, our economy was already weak and now had going to become further weakened by the time we come back into operation. And the issue is what we began from, Robert. So if you want to wrap it up, what we began from, then let us not have any more ambiguity, any more hesitation to say what needs to be said, unlike the corporate media trying to deflect the responsibility and the culpability from the Chinese to calling President Trump a xenophobic, a racist. It is very clear where the corporate media is and where the oligarchs are, the Mike Bloombergs. By the way, the Chinese expelled the journalists from the New York Times, from the Wall Street Journal, etc., but they did not expel the journalists with Michael Bloomberg's Bloomberg News or Washington Post. So you can see what is happening. So the point that I'm driving at is, let us be very clear that this is the gangster regime's assault upon the world by attacking America and trying to oust President Trump. And the flip side of it is, when shall we, the people here in Canada, in America, are going to question and ask for an accountability from our political and business leaders who engage in selling out our economy and our industry and our well-being as a liberal democracy and as a people to the Chinese over the past 30 years. And Canada still remains invested with the Chinese.
Thank you, Salim. A lot of lessons to be learned here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me and for this conversation.